niet opzij schuiven.
Is it okay if I speak like that?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say that for the students who want to go there and who have followed the lectures, that there's a reduction in the price. So who want to come, during the break, I will disclose how you get it. You have to answer 3 questions about the lectures. Okay, so this is the 4th lecture on in the series. Let me just do this. And so often the participants in the Francqui Chair, the person that come, they complain because after a few lectures it becomes less interesting. But this is different. This lecture is going to be really interesting. And so it is about the embodied cognitive semantics, pragmatics, and about emergent functionality. So let's first look at an example from historical linguists that I guess many of you know. This book by Bybee on the evolution of the future. And I may have some of the details wrong. I'm sorry, Frank, if that's the case.
H should be a superscript.
What? The H? Yes, I knew there was a problem. Anyway, so you see in Proto-Indo-European, this is about the future. Kanta, bumos, 2 different words, right?
Yes, it's first person.
This is the first person.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I'm not good in empirical work. Then in Latin we see that this has compacted in cantabit, which then again was split into cantare habet, which then in French or Spanish is again compacted, in chantera, for example. And then in French again it becomes separate things like il va chanter. Yeah. And so anyway, this is the picture, that we have sometimes the future which is inferred, then it's lexically expressed by recruiting a certain word, then it becomes compacted, so it's a morphological, synthetic way of saying it. Then there's a breakdown again, and then we have the recruitment of another word, and so the story goes. And this is an old story. There's already in the students or the researchers in historical linguistics already pointed out this kind of cyclic behavior that exists in the evolution of language. And so this is what we are studying in these lectures. So this is a field that is called evolutionary linguistics, or the Saussure used the term linguistique évolutive. I think in Dutch we have to say evolutielinguïstiek. Yeah? Are people here from Dutch linguistics? Agreement? Yeah? Okay. It's evolutiebiologie, no? Not evolutionaire biologie or something. Okay. So anyway, then the first lecture and the second I talked about self-organization and selection, because we want to understand the big principles behind this kind of process. The second lecture I talked a lot about level formation, and this is for explaining how hierarchy and levels in language emerge. And the third, this lecture, the fourth actually, is about emergent functionality. Of course I will explain what I mean by that. Just as a short summary for those who were not there the previous lectures. Oh, I should also say that each of these lectures actually focused on one kind of technology or tools that we need to do experiments in each of these areas. And so in the beginning I introduced this idea of multi-agent language games, which is the paradigm that we use to do our research. Then last time I talked about fluid construction grammar, which is a formalism, similar to HPSG or other feature-based and unification-based formalisms that we use in all our experiments. And today I will talk about experiments that we're doing in cognitive semantics and how we do all this. We do language games that involve these things. So, just as a short summary, the first puzzle that we looked at is how to create coherence. You have population of speakers, there is no central control, and so the question is, how do we nevertheless come to an agreement to speak in the same way, sufficiently similar that we understand each other. And so I introduced this idea of self-organization, which is an idea coming from biology, also used in social science. And you see, what I'm trying to do is to get inspiration from those fields and then see how we can use the ideas from those fields which have been studying evolution for a very long time, mechanisms of evolution, how we can use that to get insights into the evolution of language. And so in the case of self-organization, what it means for language is that the different speakers and listeners make their own decisions, but they're influenced by when they go into an interaction. This has an influence on them. Just like the birds in the sky, when they're flying, they look around and there's some sort of influence on how they decide to go. And then what is very important is this kind of positive feedback loop, which is that the more certain speakers prefer a particular form, particular meaning, particular sound, the more it will propagate in the population, the more others will have success with the same language elements, and as a consequence you get this kind of dynamic reaching of coherence, convergence in the population. So I gave the examples from the lexicon when I introduced this idea, but actually we have been applying this also to phonetics, to the origins of vowel systems, origins of syllable structure, and this is work particularly by Bart de Boer when he did his PhD work. There was Oxford, ended up as an Oxford publication. There was another PhD student, Pierre-Yves Audière, who also did a thesis in the same line, which was also published by Oxford University Press as a book. And so what the agents in this case are not playing language games like we talked about before, but they're doing a sort of imitation game. And so one agent would say ah, and the other tries to imitate. And if the speaker who made ah is happy that this was a good imitation, then they update their internal structures to align more. But if it's bad, then he gets feedback and says, no, it's not ah, but ah, or something like that. And then the other is trying to learn. And that way also, this is from an experiment, after 20 games we see a little bit of clustering, and the more they evolve over time, after 4,000 imitation games, they have built up a vowel system. So this is the four-month space, and you know that from phonetics, right? Okay, so this is the first principle. The second one was how language can be so well adapted to human embodiment, ecological needs, and human cognitive capacities. And there I introduced the idea of selectionism. Okay? Now again, I will be very brief, but it's important to understand those principles because I build, I build up further, right? So here I want to explain a little bit better, because in discussions we had after the previous lecture, I felt some, let's say, some confusion on particular use of selections. But So I try to explain it a little bit better. And in biology, what does that mean, selectionism? So you have, you first of all have organisms, right, like butterflies. And in biology, like Richard Dawkins, for example, in his famous book, The Selfish Gene, calls that vehicles. And so these organisms, they have certain traits, certain characteristics. They're also called phenotypic features or behaviors. For example, you know, the color of the wings, like yellow or orange or something like that. And so there are thousands of these traits, right? I mean, but then there's also something which is producing those traits. And so you have a gene, and you have the expression of that gene within a particular context, and this is establishing the trait. So the trait is not, you know, is not equal, well, is not there, right? It has to be produced. That's a very important distinction, critical distinction to understand. And then what happens is that these organisms are behaving in the environment. And so they have interactions with the environment. And of course, these interactions, when they interact, when they find a mate, for example, or they just sit on a tree or whatever, then some of these traits are important. Because let's say there's a beast that likes yellow butterflies a lot. And so the butterfly sitting there, being yellow, you know, and it likes the yellow ones. Well, that's it. It would be better to be orange, right? So depending on the traits that you have, there is replication, differential replication. And so that these producers, so the genes, but also all the machinery actually to express those genes, gives rise to, those that gave rise to these traits. So there's this kind of net effect that you end up with a species which is well adapted. So this is a picture of this, which is the organism, the genes, and the production of traits. This is interacting with the environment. Notice the very nice graphics here. And then there's a replication, which can be two types actually. It's an adaptation, which means the gene is kept, but this process of expression changes somehow. Or it can be a mutation of some sort, so it's replication with a mutation so that the gene is different. Now, if you don't immediately understand this, okay, but let's make the comparison to language. And so here again, the language users are now the vehicles, right? And the traits are the features of language. Like in the sound system, the syntactic structures, grammatical constructions, conceptualizations, whatever. These are all traits, these are all characteristics of the language that's used by these language users. And then, of course, you need internally the cognitive mechanisms to produce those traits, right? So that you need a constructicon with construction schemas and categorizers, and a way to recognize and articulate all these sounds. So these are the producers. And then, just like in biological evolution, these there are linguistic interactions, language games, so utterances that are produced, which exercise certain of these traits. And this impacts whether they will be replicated. So if we have this picture here, then you have a linguistic interaction. There's replication, which is either an adaptation, you could say, like increasing the score or adding a particular, another way to use the same thing, or actually have an innovation, so that like invention of a new word or things like that. So you see, I'm a bit hesitant to talk about memes, because to me it's not very clear when they talk about memes what that really means. I mean, many people have used that, mimetic evolution, as a way to have a theory of cultural evolution. And everybody feels there is a kind of relationship, right, between genetic evolution and language evolution. Well, Darwin already thought about that. But the precise way in which it happens is kind of, has been discussed a lot. And so this is the way that, that we are doing it, okay? Now then I showed examples last time of where this is applied, because the idea is to apply this principle then to concrete examples, right, to do case studies. And so one is the that we did for color, which is language games between robots. And so we play like with the Munsell chips. You know, these robots are playing a game, and one is thinking, I want to draw attention, let's say, to the middle one of these chips, and then conceptualizes, categorizes, and say maybe light blue. And then the other one, has to point to one of these objects and gets feedback whether he pointed to the right one. So won't really tell the story, but we saw that we've been able to figure out completely how from scratch there can be not only a lexicon of color terms, but also the color categories that are expressed by these color terms. And from a very diffuse situation, you see in the population that they cluster. And this experiment also showed that there's coevolution in the sense that you have the selectionist system for words, you have a selection system for coming up with the categories, and if you couple the two, you get coevolution. And then you see that when you do that with language, then you get a higher or less category variance than if you do it without language. In other words, language is a way to not only to coordinate the language itself, of course, using the self-organization mechanism, but also the way we conceptualize reality. So that's very important from a semantic point of view, to say, well, if we don't all have the same categories, if the way that we speak determines to some extent the way we see the world and conceptualize the world, then we need a mechanism to nevertheless get coherence between speakers and in the same language group. And so this is a way to explain that. Okay, so this was the part number 2. The part number 3, we talked about levels, and there I talked about how we could use, again, ideas from biology on how you get level formation, like in from solitary bees to colonies where bees are specialized, and then to swarms. I cannot, talk about this again, but I showed again with experiments that we've done in the emergence of grammar, and we gave a live demonstration with a robot last time, how actually a grammatical system, a syntactic system, can emerge by using these principles. So this is all, you see the way we operate, right? So we try to tackle fundamental questions, find a fundamental principle, and find it usually in biology or social science, but I didn't talk about that. And then to really understand it, formalize it, operationalize it, and then do experiments with in software or with real robots to test these ideas. Now, the question is, what problems are left? I mean, of course, we have to apply it to many other examples, and we've done it. A lot of the things that I'm talking about is the work of PhD students. I'm just telling it like that, but actually, like the color experiment was actually 2 PhDs that worked on this, each for at least 6 years to do these experiments. So they're really very challenging to do. And we can do a lot more. If you give me 50 graduate students, I know what they have to do. Unfortunately, I don't have any graduate students. But what is missing? Well, you could say self-organization explains how a population makes a particular choice. Okay? So you have diffuse possibilities, like different words for the same meaning, and then we can show how the population converges to an agreement. Okay? Excellent. Now, selection helps us to explain how a choice is made that fits with the constraints of the embodiment, like in the case of speech or color, vision, constraints from cognition, constraints from the ecology. So it explains how language can be adapted to the, to the constraints and needs. But then we would like, what I did not explain, is where these choices come from. Okay, it's a lot about how you choose a choice, one of these choices, but not yet so much about where the choices come from. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And so this is again a fundamental question in biology, actually. Let's say Darwinian processes, they tell us about the survival of the fittest, but they don't tell us about the arrival of the fittest. This is a book, by the way, by Andreas Wagner. So the arrival, how is it discovered? And not discovered by somebody, a designer, right, in an office, who says, today we're going to improve the butterflies or something. But this happens in processes. And we would like to understand in language also, there is not somebody that sits in an office somewhere and says, let's make the verb phrase better today, then tell everybody how they should speak. So, now the idea is emergent functionality, and I will explain in a minute what it is about. We're also going to be very interested in cognitive semantics, because and embodied cognitive semantics in particular, because obviously the perception and embodiment and all these things play a very big role in where new linguistic innovations come from. And so I've been very happy actually to work together, well, not work together, but talk a lot with people like Langacker here. Here he's busy actually creating an agent in the Talking Heads experiment. Okay, and then not only the embodied cognitive semantics, but also we're going to be interested in morphology, in how morphologies emerge. And here are two examples. These are from Talmi. One is from Atsuwegi, which is, I think, an American Indian language. And this is from Bantu. And you see there that, you have in one word, actually, you have all these different meanings that are expressed. So this is an alternative way to get complexity in language, alternative to the syntactic structures that we studied previous lecture. Okay, so this was the introduction. I don't know whether there's any remark so far, or any question already. Okay, so I keep going. So now the emergent functionality, what is it? Okay, well, so as you know, I not only am interested in language, but also in AI and in embodiment and those things. And so we do lots of experiments with robots. These are the humanoid robots that we use, with Curio. There are also other types of robots. Humanoids. This is a very small robot, but we also used one like that. But before we used these kinds of robots, we used Lego vehicles. And you know, this is our lab in Brussels, and we built a setup, an ecosystem in which those robots had to do work in order to get energy from the charging station. And so you see this robot slides into the charging station and then has an antenna and can then fill up its batteries. Now, this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And we used Lego at that time because we were very poor. Well, we're still very poor, but you know, we could only afford Lego and use what do you call that? Elastic to put them together and things like that. Now, maybe I'll show this clip again, because one of the key things that we studied at that time was the idea of emergent behavior. And you see here that the robot has found this box and pushes against it until the light is out. And then it kind of goes into the charging station. The question is, how do we implement those behaviors? And at the time there was a lot of interest to find an alternative way, because you can do it in two ways. You could say, okay, the robot sees the light and then computes the angle, you know, and then goes in the direction of the angle. So this is a kind of programmed behavior. Now, emergent behavior is that you implement other behaviors, actually, which at first sight have nothing to do with what you want to achieve. But if you have these behaviors in interaction with the environment, they do what you hope, well, that they will do. For example, suppose wall following. Okay, so you could make a robot follow a wall by having sensors and detecting walls and then deciding, okay, I want to be that far from the wall, so and measuring everything. This is how robots are traditionally still built. But with emergent behavior, you say the robot is just going around randomly, and if it hits the wall, it pulls a little bit back, you know. So now if you do that, well, you're attracted to the wall, and you're pushed back from the wall. And if you have these two forces, then you actually follow the wall. And also here for it has two light sensors, and there's a bit of, when the one on the left has more than the one on the right, it turns a little bit, and if the right more than the left, it turns a little bit, and that way it goes into the charging station. So this idea is called emergent behavior. Which is that you have components, functioning components in the environment, and then leading to certain positive side effects. Now, the side effects, they actually, well, you could say they get discovered by the robot by exploring what, well, we could say, what is sometimes called the adjacent possible, which is a behavior that's, you know, not really implemented, but almost there. This is a term used by Stuart Kaufman, or invented by Stuart Kaufman. But there's another term which is by Vygotsky, used in learning theory, which is also a child that's developing and is able to do certain things, and just on the edge, you know, to be able to do something more, right? It's also used in biology by François Jacob, for example. It's a Nobel Prize in evolutionary biology. And then once this side effect is discovered, then it gets preserved somehow. And that's when you get from emergent behavior, which happens to happen, to emergent functionality, which is something that you can then use and store and to build further on. Now, I wanted to give an example from biology, but that's a little bit complicated. This is a paper that was sent to me a few days ago by a colleague, Cristina Puchades, who works in the place where I work now is an Institute for Evolutionary Biology, I should say. So everybody talks about that stuff. And if you read it, this is about development it's about guaranteeing precise tissue architecture. So this is about the brain of a zebrafish and about the formation of the brain. And in that, it's very important to have level formation, to have areas, because if there are areas in development, then it's easier to have growth processes in that area. And so the question is, to prevent cell intermingling and so on. So it's about level formation. And then if you read the part of this paper, it says evolution rarely produces novelties from scratch, but works on the weak, promiscuous, pre-existing activities. And so this is this idea of emergent functionality. There's a kind of weak, promiscuous, pre-existing stuff, okay, or appears by genomic tinkering. So tinkering is this thing that François Jacob talked about, this kind of fooling around a little bit, And if you fool around, then you find new things. And then the trick is to see that it's a new thing and then to build further on it. Anyway, I won't go into the details of this particular example, but just to say that at the moment in evolutionary biology, this idea of emergent functionality is very prominent, it's very important. It's also something in development of technology which you see. In the lab in Paris, at some point we were playing around with smartphones. I'm talking about, 2006, 2007 when this was starting. And we're thinking about what we could do with it. And then the idea came up to connect sensors to it and to help people to map out the pollution in the city. And so I was doing this with Eugenio Tiselli, who is from, I think from Chile or something like that. Well, South America in any case. Sorry, my geography of, I hope they're not good in South America. No, Mexico. I think he was from Mexico, which is in the same area, right? Okay. And so we were building this kind of thing. You see, it's thinking to find out what can you do with smartphones more than just talk to them. Now, it turned out that it didn't work because it's very difficult to have these sensors being calibrated. So we thought, well, maybe we do noise, noise exposure. And then with some other people, Nicolas Maisonneuve and so on, then we started to do the sound, to use that for measuring sound pollution, noise in other words. And so this was the noise tube system. So this is about a year later. And then to my big pleasure, the system developed completely was picked up by other groups at VUB. They built a noise tube system, did experiments. This is from noise measuring in Brussels. This is in Paris. And maybe for those who live in Antwerp, there's some people from Antwerp, Ademloos, is that something you know? So they used this system to actually map out noise pollution. And so this is an example of innovation in technology where we started out, tinkering, seeing things that didn't quite work, trying something else. I mean, actually to go from the initial idea to a real system took quite a while because if you don't, it turns out that they put all sorts of filters in a mobile phone to optimize for speech. So you have to go around that system in order to do it. So you get a, optimization of the functions that you want. Anyway, I should talk more about language, right? But this is just to say, where you can get ideas from, right? To think about things in language, actually. So now, emergent functionality in language. Okay, so the idea is that it's like the robot who is fooling around, There's something like also tinkering, tinkering going on, because you know, words are used in new ways, in new contexts. Maybe grammatical constructions, you made errors and they are a bit different, but then it turns out they're useful for something. I mean, they have an effect, they have a positive effect in communication. And so there's a kind of similarity to emergent behavior. And then, of course, you have to have the preservation of that side effect and reuse it in the future. And this is how I think we can understand these kinds of things. Because they're also like new combinations that are made between different kinds of words. And of course, in the beginning, they are suggestive, right? Or if you take the example of will, development of the auxiliary will in English, it's well known that will was a main verb initially with full lexical power, and then which is used because will is like want, which suggests future. So it's weakly expressing what you want to express. But then it becomes optimized in the sense of, or specialized in the sense of that will, you know, gradually is losing some of its lexical power to only express future, and is also losing some of its syntactic potential as a main verb in order to be more, you know, used as an auxiliary, right? So, for example, the conjugation is different and things like that. So that's the idea, okay? And so we try to learn again from the biologists, from people who have studied in social science innovation processes, and we try to use that in order to understand well, the emergence of these structures in language. And so I'm going to give in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to give a few examples of experiments that we have done in our lab to explore this idea, of course, always with selection and self-organization, you know, level formation is also there, right? So it's on top of that, or in addition to that, we use these mechanisms. And so the first one, well, the first thing that we need is actually that word forms have multiple possibilities, which they usually have. Or constructions have multiple possibilities. I mean, there's not a single word in a language which has only one meaning, right? So the question is, in the earlier examples that I showed, and in the demo that we showed, I mean, a particular word has a particular meaning, like red is the color red, and not other meanings that could be. But in natural language, most words have a cloud of meanings, in fact. Mm-hmm. Okay, and so we need to try and understand how our experiments which worked on one word, one meaning, how they can work on multiple meanings that are flexible. That means that new meanings may come up. Maybe some of them are more important than others, and it becomes fluid. You know, the word meanings become fluid. So this is the first thing that I will talk about. Then we also did experiments to investigate how meanings developed in one domain, let's say for describing physical postures, how they could, how they could map to another domain. For example, postures of people, like sitting, standing, lying, and so on, how they then become used, or can become used for talking about objects, like this cable lies, do you say that, lies on the table, you know, where a computer sits, maybe? I mean, I feel a bit insecure because in different languages, different Germanic languages, as you know, there are differences between the mapping that is used. So that's the second example I want to show. And then the third example I want to show, this will all be quite brief, is about how this morphology, how words evolve into morphological markers, and also this erosion of morphological markers. So these are case studies of different processes that are all happening when we talk about emergent functionality. So the first one is about adaptive word meanings. And I guess I don't need to show a robot clip, do I? You all seen it? Yeah. I'll show one later when the attention is going down. Okay, so these are experiments with real humanoid robots, and they play language games. And as opposed to a word having one meaning, the word will have a cloud of meanings. And this was particularly a topic that Peter Wellens, one of the PhD students in the lab, worked on that, made his thesis about this topic. And so the thing is that, so we wanted to understand, these flexible meanings, right, of the word. And so here you see, this is for one language game on the left, this is what the robot sees. This is the visual analysis of it. And this is what the other robot sees. And the thing is, even though they are the same robots, the same cameras, more or less, it turns out that this is categorization. These are prototypes in the categorical spaces. So you have, like in the demo that was given, so you have, for example, the yellow-blue channel. This is the brightness, luminance channel. You have the width, you have the height, you have the X and Y, the vertical positions. And these are all prototypes, okay? So yellow, blue, you would have one for most yellow and another one for most blue, and then maybe one in the middle and things like that. Now, the important thing is that for the same object, let's say the green, this green object, okay, so the robots stand in different positions, so they see it from different angles, right? You get different perceptual values. The thing that might be the biggest from one point of view might be the second biggest from another point of view. And as a consequence, if you play language games, you can no longer, you do not necessarily share the same categorization, okay? Usually in cognitive science is very much oriented towards a single individual. But if you go and look at the group, all sorts of problems appear, because it's for a physically embodied agent sees the world from different points of view. There's no, you cannot have a global view. Of course, we can have a camera hanging from the ceiling, but that's cheating, right? They all have their own camera. And so it turns out that, I'm not going to go in all the details, but then we use the same sort of mechanisms that I explained earlier and that were shown in the demo for building categories and for building language. And then here you see that examples of experiments. This is for bigger populations. This is after 50,000 language games, so there's a lot more. And then you see actually that a word meaning now is a network with different values here, and the values reflect how much this word means that, okay, or the opposite, how much this meaning, if you have this meaning, how you could say it's a score, but the score is different from the score we had before. The score is saying how central are you, or how important are you for this word. If you hear this word, what's the first thing that you think about? And so what you see is that there's an evolution in that over time. And this evolution is unescapable because of the different ways that they see reality. Because one robot might say, let's say, abazu, meaning bright and thin, okay? But then for the other robot, it's not the most thin. In fact, it's bright and red. Okay, and so he will expand the meanings, or maybe the meanings will shift, you know, in the sense that things which are bright and small are always red. So bright, red, small become a cluster of meanings around the same word. So word meanings can become more restricted, or they can become more general. For example, you can have a word that is, you know, pretty clear, meaning small and orange, and then with more games and so on, it starts to mean only orange. And so this is the idea, and then of course, you know, we have done these experiments on a bigger scale to show that and to compare. This is with the technique of using these flexible word meanings, and this is where they are fixed word meanings, like in the experiment that Katrien and Paul showed last time. And then you see that if you use this kind of flexible meaning, you know, in real world conditions, you get a more solid, more robust kind of system. And of course, you get also a system that then is on the way towards this emergent functionality, where there's new innovations that are happening in, or more easily happening in the way your lexicon is evolving. Okay? So this is an example of an experiment. This is a PhD thesis, by the way. It's only 3 slides, but it took 4 years, right, to be able to make this work. But these are experiments that we can do to really investigate, you know, all the variations, conditions, stability. Can we make this work on real robots? So this is one example. How am I doing here? In time.
55 minutes. We've been speaking for 55 minutes now.
55 minutes. Okay, that's very good. Do you want a break now?
No?
Well, we can take more time for discussion. Okay. Don't rush. Yes. Okay. Very good. So I showed. Are there any questions about that? Yes.
Yeah, about the number of participants in these games. Are they usually like 2 or 3 or 4 people? Or is it robots? Or
yeah.
is it much larger than that?
This one is 25.
When we talk about language communities, like for instance the Dutch language community,
Yeah.
that's millions of people. And somehow we all speak the same language, with
Yeah.
variation in it.
Yeah.
So you need also an explanation for the fact that the interaction with, say, 20 people, 25 people will generalize to interaction, to common code with millions of people.
Yeah.
So how is this extra step
Well,
counted for?
extra, it's not an extra step, but the first thing to say is that we do the experiments and only 2 agents are allowed to speak at the same time. Okay, we do that in order to be able to follow very well what's going on. Now, of course, in a population, there's a lot of parallelism. So that's one point. There could be parallelism here, but we don't do it to be able to study better what's going on. The second thing is that there are the scaling laws that we know. And so I briefly talked about that the first day, but probably it was a bit too quick. But if you want, I can go back to that slide. And so we know that that it's not the case that with increasing the size of the population, that you also increase the time needed to stabilize the system. So partly because new agents that come into the population are picking up a system that already exists. So the real hard part is the beginning, to get it off the ground, because there, the choices are, well, particularly if you have a pure naming game where you can use any random word that you want, then obviously you have a big search space, and so you have more search. But it's not that we know about scaling, and you know, if you have already a stable system in place, it's still going to evolve because innovations are still coming in, and the ones coming in the system have to learn the system that is there and can contribute to innovation in the system. But the, you know, so the scaling is not a problem. Yes, two questions.
I still have a problem with the why. So, looking at this from small in orange to orange, that the orange becomes the dominant meaning and that it is scaled down, all of and due to the perception, I understand that, but I'm still left with why is it?
Well, I think, you know, this is in this world of the robots, right? These
Yeah.
geometric figures that they have. So it's not, they don't see fruit and they don't see this and that. But I think what the way to understand it is that in these games until now, that most of the time the orange object, which is a ball or maybe a pyramid or something like that, I don't know, we have to look at the examples, you know, then the thing that was orange was always small also.
Okay.
And
So
then
I
at some
completely
point,
agree.
you know, because these are open environments, at some point, examples start to appear where, I don't know, because it's closer. You see, we change the environment, because that's also very important. I didn't emphasize that too much yet, but, you know, we want, language is an open system, right? We always have to be able to deal with new situations. This is also the reason why we explore these techniques, is to be able to deal with change in the environment. And so when we do these kinds of experiments, we keep shifting the objects around, or the robots walk around actually, until they find a situation that they want to talk about. And so we have no control over where they are in the space with respect to the objects. In the demo last time, the robot was standing still here, because if the robot falls from the table, that's the end of our experiments, right? So we didn't do that. But so that's the idea. The environment is open, and I suspect if you would start to examine, then you would see that more and more in the environment there would be small and orange is no longer together. Yes.
Yeah, just to come back to Frank's question and scale problem, isn't one of the issues that you seem to assume full intercommunicability within the community, whereas in actual communities of all the 25 million speakers of Dutch, I only spoke to 10 or 20.
Yeah, that's indeed a very important point. And again, there have been studies, you know, in the first lecture actually I gave a list of issues. Now each of these, maybe I should go back to it, why not? Maybe this is not the right version. I don't know. Sorry. So these are the questions. Strange. See, I showed this slide, scaling laws slide. And so these are the questions that we pose at the theoretical level. Okay, and you know, the convergence with respect to population size. And there have been PhD theses, not just in our lab, but also outside, just about that question. And then one of the things is that here. What is the impact of population structure on convergence? And then the population structure can be of different types, but one of these is social structure. Can also be geographic structure. And so the structure in the population influences the probability that two agents are speaking with each other, which then has an impact on the the time for convergence and things like that. And so there have been quite interesting papers. Well, actually here I have one. Like this one, for example, is about impact of network structure. And in social science they have these different types of networks, like with central hubs and with communities split up. So a hub is somebody that has more influence on the language than another one, and things like that. And so there's, I cannot go into more detail here, but this is these are things that we worry about a lot. And then, and by the way, and these, to study these things, this is the size of the population. So it's, the 100,000, 10,000, 100,000. And so these are experiments running on supercomputers to actually study the scaling laws. Okay, but I must say this stuff is in the hands of physicists mostly, statistical physics, like Andrea Baronchelli, Vittorio Loreto, and so on. Okay, yeah. Are there other questions? Yes.
When you said that in the new experiments words can have different meanings, I was confused a little bit. What you mean by that is that different meaning dimensions can be more or less important, but on one dimension of each dimensions you only have a single prototype.
Yeah.
So my question is, do you also experiment with different prototypes on the same dimension or different combinations?
So let me just get back to where we were first. Yeah. So this is the example. Yeah, I think as far as I remember, because this dates from 10 years ago. Peter also looked at, let's say, scale within a dimension, right? Which we also did actually already in the talking heads experiment. So you could have a scale where you have large and small, but then you refine it. So you have large, quite large, and so on, and so and you refine more and more. And so then the prototype, well, it's not it's a sort of area in your space, can be at different grain size, different levels of grain size. And then it's perfectly possible to have different levels and prototypes for the same word. So that the word that means, let's say, very big for a while, then becomes generalized to big, or big becomes specific for very big. Yeah. Okay. Good. So you see, I think what's important in these lectures is just to see what kind of stuff that we're doing, and I give examples of it. And at each of these, we can give a whole lecture series about just that, right? But today is more about feeling, getting a feeling for it. Okay, so now I go to the next thing, which I think is also close to the heart of the cognitive semanticist, which is about body postures. And like from the work of Martin Lemmens, who is also here partly, that there is extension of the original words for, let's say, giving a command like sit, to posture descriptions, then descriptions of objects, and then metaphorical extensions of it. So the question is, how is this possible, right? What are the mechanisms underneath? And again, this is a mixture of selection, self-organization, and this emergent functionality. So we've done experiments, this is particularly with Michael Spranger, on that. And so the experiments are again with real robots, Curio robots. And so if you mean from the viewpoint of cognitive semantics, and particularly embodiment, if you believe, like Lego, for example, that embodiment is really important for semantics and language, then it's a good idea to use real robots, right? Because then you can really say, what do you mean by embodiment? Right? Here is the embodiment, and how is the communication possible? And so the first thing that we had to do is to find out how such a robot could acquire models of its own body. So now there are different types of models. There are visual models of the body. There are motor images, proprioception. There's also internal simulation of body movements. And then there's the cognitive, I would say cognitive body image. It's about sit, stand, raise left arm. This is where we start categorizing the world, in this case body movements, body postures that are relevant to us. And there are differences in different cultures what that is. And then what it means, when you make a movement, does this mean future or does it mean past, for example? And so I have a few clips about all this stuff, which I'd like you to show. And so some of the first, let me first show something else. Yes, so we set up, the idea is that the robot, can you see? No, you can't see. Okay, we do a bit of a show now. I'll show all the video clips and then we go back to the slide. So this is what the robots look like that we used in these experiments. And okay. And so one of the things that we have done is, the question is, how do you learn about body images? Well, if you look at children, from babies from a young age, they are doing what is called motor babbling. They move their body and they are basically learning the relationship between body movements and what the body can do. So it's a sort of, tinkering actually, but with body movements. And then there is, we use quite a bit mirrors so that the robot looks at itself. Did it do anything? So the robot looks at itself in the mirror. Now, children don't do that much, depending. But, and so this is the way actually that they acquire their body. So here is a robot before the mirror. And so it's doing motor babbling. Now, this is what the robot is seeing through the camera. And this is various kinds of image processing, segmentation going on. And this is the visual image after segmentation of gestures. And so this is the proprioception. That means these are the various motor controls, because the robot has access to its own motor control. And then while it's doing these movements, it's also simulating its own bodily movements. So it's sort of building an internal predictive model of its own body. And so these are sensors actually, because in the different positions of arms and body, they're full of sensors. So that's the way that the robot first develops by moving and by being in the world, right? It develops a kind of body knowledge. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Yeah. Okay. And then we have these robots playing language games. So one robot is asking for a particular movement, the other one is doing it, and then if it's the right movement, he will give positive feedback. If it's not, then it will show what the movement is. And so this is the way that this is the language game in this case, right? Before we showed language games where they point to objects, but here they are doing movements. And they could potentially ask, pick up the red block. Okay, I mean that's how it would build up, right? And so, but here it's about the body. Let's see, what else do I have here? Okay, now I'm quickly showing this also because I want to go back to the slides. It's difficult to go back and forth. But remember the network that I showed for the color in the color experiment. So this is an example network between visual images, but actually visual prototypes of postures. These are words that they invent, and these are behaviors on the robot, so movements, of the robot. And what you could see is that, in the beginning, this is a single agent in the memory structure of a single agent, and you see that the network was very, interconnected, and then here this is the strength with which this visual prototype is associated with that particular word. You see, by the way, now and then connections being made, or new behaviors coming up, like here, B1. Or there, you see they're moving, they're learning from the other. But you also see that after a while, there is kind of, for every visual prototype, there is a word and there is a behavior associated with it. But it's dynamic. This is in a population with many robots. What we do actually is we download the agent in the body of a robot. The robot plays a language game, and then at the end of the game we upload the agent's state so that other agents can use the same bodies, because we don't have that many bodies. Okay, so this is basically the same principles that we used as in the color experiments. So we have done experiments also for spatial language, for other domains, and it's always the same thing in a way, but of course the details of it, if you do space, then you need spatial presence and you need perception in the world and things like that. Okay, so I go back to the slides. So, the visual body image, you've seen it. The motor body image, I mean, here I don't have a picture, but it's also about motor control, how you execute it. And then there's a number of possible prototypes that can be extracted. The prototype, by the way, looks like this in the visual space. These are different dimensions. and this is your pattern recognition techniques to characterize a prototype in terms of a number of dimensions. So again, it's not color or space, but it's the same ideas that about categorization in feature extraction. This is, by the way, if the robot is just doing motor babbling, this is what happens. Just to see that you go from in the visual domain and the motor domain, you know, this is very messy, and you get very complex structures. But then you can extract clusters in that. You can extract different categories for different kinds of movements. Okay, this is the network that I showed you before. And so you have sensory experiences. They are categorized in terms of postures, and then these postures are motor programs that can then be performed. So that's the network, and then there's categorization going on, learning through motor babbling of the control programs. But the point is then that in the experiments I showed with the robots, what is happening is that with these let's say posture prototypes here, okay, you not only get motor behaviors and visual perception, but you also get words in the network. And so they play the game, right? And that way they associate words with those prototypes. And you could say, isn't that very difficult? Well, yes, but again, it's like in the case of language, color, language helps. Because I can say to you, sit, and then you don't know what it means, but then the other one is sitting, then you have to figure out how you can also sit, you see? So the learning of the language is impacting also what you will have as prototypes, visually and in the motor space. Anyway, so this is an experiment, and you see this is the number of interactions they had. I mean, the populations are usually not big here, but that's a matter of time, not a matter of principle. And then you see things like, you know, how communicative success goes up. This is the blue line, and how well, you always have two L and R, two different agents here, and then also how you know, they converge on the same meanings and the same prototypes and things like that. So this was just the first part. Now now comes the part of the emergent functionality, which is that once we build that kind of thing, we wanted to see whether these agents are also capable to do this kind of metaphorical mapping from the physical posture domain into description of objects in a scene. And so suppose that the robot sees this, has some sort of network to recognize, and this is the prototype, okay, of that posture. Now, what we then give are situations like this. A ball is next to a block, but it's about this block, okay? And then it turns out that the same networks that can, we just apply the network that was learned for recognizing body postures to situations in the world. And then actually, like, you know, think about lying. The block is lying down. Right? So the robot is lying down, and this is a particular visual image can be recognized by these robots in earlier experiments. And now they're applying the same visual perception, you know, and come to a prototype. It's not the same, by the way. But then, and then they reuse the word that they had for the sit or lie. They reuse it to talk about this situation. Okay. And so that's this experiment here, where actually this curve is the probability that they talk about things like this, or they talk about things like that. And you see that, I mean, the probability of playing a reference game like that is 0, but then after 1,000 games it increases. But interestingly, you see communicative success does not go down, which it normally should, because you haven't learned yet a language for talking about these things. But that's because in this phase, they're just reusing the networks that they have and reusing the words that they have to talk about these situations. We have done a few others. One was about brightness and full color that I mentioned briefly on one of the earlier lectures, which is that we know from historical linguistics also that there's a switch often between brightness-based words. This is for English, actually. I'm sorry, I don't have the reference here, but Cardon or something like this. These are Old English color words, but actually, I mean, like yellow meant more shiny as opposed to hue. And then a switch happened from using predominantly brightness dimensions to hue dimensions. And so we've also, or the opposite. And so we've also done experiments in that kind of thing, which is again the same. You play language games, you get situations where the most bright object is also the yellow object. So brightness and yellow are very related. If I say yellow and you think brightness, and I think hue, we still understand each other. So there is communication, the system is coming off the ground. But then, of course, there might be situations where the yellow object is not the brightest object, and that's where a split is beginning to happen, and so on. So you can simulate all that stuff. Okay? Yeah. So I go to the final example, and then we can have some discussion. So this is this one here. These are experiments that oops, where is this coming from? Right. So this one here. So we became interested in the origins of morphology. And well, I don't need to explain what that means in this context. Essentially, this is about expressing this kind of case system, expressing the roles of objects in which arguments, predicates. And this is something that you can also do with word order and prepositions, but we're interested in these situations where you have inflections or where you have particles like in Japanese. And so we've done case studies. This is with Catherine, who is also here, on the origins of agreement systems. And there's an article in PLOS ONE. And so, well, these are examples from Latin. It turns out that in sign language you also have case systems. Like this means the son, dog, but the point is that you see signing of son and then pointing to an object which is like a marker. It is indexed to a particular situation which is reused to then say to have possession. Okay. Oh, my son's dog, that's what it is. So son, my, but here he's pointing to the son, right? And then dog, possession, but is again referring back. He's making this sign at the place where of the son. So in sign languages also you have marker systems that have emerged. Okay, all of you know this picture, right? It's the theory. Gibbon talked about it. Lehmann, grammaticalization, Heine, and so on. And so there's a recruitment of an existing word. And this is for me again an example of this emergent functionality, right? There's a word that has a certain meaning, then there's a fully lexical item, but it becomes used for something else, you could say, for marking that two words are about the same thing, like in adjective noun agreement. Okay? And then the agreement marker, there's an evolution that we know, phonological reduction, there's an evolution of what's called bleaching, that the meaning becomes more abstract and conventional, and so possibly that it erodes, and that's the end of your system. Okay. So we have worked quite a bit on simulating this whole process, and I cannot go. I just go into some aspects of it, but this is in bigger populations. This is in again with language games, and so the games, they are based on, actually you have a lexicon, lexicon of words. Let's say you have a lexicon which is talking about people. Okay? And so there's a word for woman and a word for man, but also words for big and small and etc. And so you want to say big, dark-haired, sees, small, blonde-haired. Okay. Now you want to say the dark-haired and the big are together, right? It's about the same person. And then I have to remember this example: small and blonde-haired. Okay. But you don't use syntax. You want to use markers for it. So you could start by recruiting in a word, for example, a word for woman and a word for man, and say big woman, long-haired, dark-haired woman, right? So you use woman you repeat that word for every of the words that are referring to the same object, okay? So this is how it starts. And then the meaning, woman has a lot of meanings. It's a rich word, as every word is. Well, man also, yes. But then the meanings become restricted, and also the markers become restricted. And so this is examples of these experiments. And I just want to talk a little bit about the phonological reduction, which is the process that you start with a full word and then it becomes maybe just one letter, okay? Like you see in Latin, the morphological system. And so this is a phonological evolution where the original word that was recruited is oxfa, and what the agents are doing is they try to optimize in a way the length of the marker that they are using. And so you see that it's a very stupid mechanism here. If you are a phonetician, you would use an articulatory model to have the things being cut away that, in fast articulation. But this is not so sophisticated, but you see it's only the last letter that's being cut off the marker. And so this is in a population of agents. That's important to realize, that there's nobody says, everybody now, it's not oxfa anymore, but oxf. Okay. No, there's some people who are saying oxfa, some are saying oxf, because they're talking fast and oxf, and they just leave out the a. And then you see that here oxfa is dominant, but then here it begins to be oxf, and that becomes dominant. And then there are already some who are just saying ox. You see? And then here the whole system has collapsed because some people are just saying oh, but it's regenerating and and O has become the marker. So all these processes, the selection, self-organization, yeah. Okay, that's another example where they start from Uin Bui, becomes dominant, the whole thing is really in trouble here, then Ui, then U. And so what you see in these experiments is how the length of the marker is decreasing, and this is the efficiency and also the variation in the population. We can track all that in these experiments. And so the population is going towards a more efficient system, phonetically speaking. But then what you see often in evolution is that this kind of phonological erosion and stripping of complexity in the system is leading to more complexity in another level, right? Because you get syncretism, and so there's more ambiguity. And so this is where Remy van Trepp, who is also in our group, who has made his PhD thesis actually on emergence of case grammar, he has worked a lot on this to understand how the different competing forces in language, there's not an optimum, it's not going straight towards the optimal language, but because that doesn't exist. There's always, you can optimize the phonetically, but then you're losing some information on a syntactic level, or you create ambiguity on a syntactic level, and so then maybe after a while you get it, like in Dutch, when you just have de, and that means your whole morphological system has collapsed, and then you need a new invention, or an existing invention, in this case syntactic structure, phrase structure, is going to overtake that system. And so you see how incredibly exciting all this is, right? Because you can take, it's totally complementary to what goes on in historical linguistics, and you need linguistic background to, you can understand what we're doing. Because most people in computer science, they've never heard what an agreement system is, just to give an example. So this is really linguistics, and taking what is observed by historical linguistics about changes in the language, and then the difference with historical linguists and, let's say, evolutionary linguistics is that you try to understand what are the mechanisms. You try to understand why certain developments could take place, and they're just not accidental. I mean, the shift from here to there, that, let's say, certain aanvallen, or markers, that they become the same, is not arbitrary, right? There's a whole logic to the system. And so with these mechanisms, you can understand the logic, you can formulate hypotheses, you can test them in computer simulations, because you can reconstruct, as Remy has done, you can reconstruct Old High German, and then you turn on the evolutionary machinery, and you see what happens. Of course, you will not end up necessarily with Middle High German. It's not a predictive science. Historical science is never predictive, right? Biology is not predictive. But it helps you to understand that one of the paths that evolution has taken can be understood and can be explained. Okay, this is my final slide for these four lectures. So I hope to have given you some idea what it is that we are doing. And we try to understand these processes which have been identified by historical linguists. We try to use concepts, principles from biology or social science or other sciences. So why do we do that? Because you see, when we see the same phenomena in biology like selection, it's a general principle. system principle, you know, that you find in systems. So it then linguistics is no longer a different kind of science compared to the other sciences. I mean, they all talk about selection, right, and about self-organization, you know. So it would be odd that these things don't play a role in linguistics. And so this is a way to be more universal in a way, in terms of scientific insight, and to establish communication also with other disciplines. So, and then of course also why we use these principles from biology or physics is then all the machinery. These people have done a lot of work on these principles. So, for example, on self-organization, there's a lot of mathematical theory also on selection, you know, game theory, all these kinds of things that we can use to give a foundation, a theoretical foundation for, well, historical linguistics, I would say, but the mechanistic part of historical linguistics. So, that's what, more or less, what I wanted to say. So, yeah, we have time for a few questions. Just some discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, what I really like about the graphs that you're showing is that a lot of them have error bars and confidence intervals that you rerun the experiments a number of